I'm excited to share with you what Muslim life is like because we need to understand our friends and the people we want to share the gospel with if we're going to share it with them in a compelling way. Muslims are not like the average secular person generally, insofar as they believe in God, and they're quite often, if they're devout Muslims, trying to follow God in many avenues of their life. They're regularly remembering Him, they're praying, memorized prayers, or sometimes even occasional prayers from their heart. So let's take a look at what Muslim life was like, and I can share that with you from my story. When I was a young child, my mom had taught me that I need to follow Islam to the best of my ability. And so what I had been taught was to start off the day first thing in the morning by thanking Allah for waking me up. The prayer that I had memorized, I would recite in Arabic, Alhamdulillahilladhi ahyana ba'dama amatana wa alayhin nushur. I didn't know what that meant at the time. My mom hadn't taught me the translation, but later I found out what it meant was all praise belongs to the one who gives me life, causes me to die, and will raise me up again. So it's a prayer thanking God for the afterlife, thanking Him for the fact that we will all be raised from the dead on the day of judgment. But it was also a reminder to thank God for waking me up from sleep, because sleep is a sort of death. Thank you, Allah, for waking me up every morning for the day. So that's how I would start the day before my feet left the bed. After leaving the bedroom, I would go to the bathroom to do a ceremonial washing. Before each of the 5 daily prayers, Muslims do a ceremonial washing. It's called wudu. And during the wudu itself, you're reciting prayers that you had memorized in Arabic. Well, while walking into the washroom to start the wudu, I would remember every day to walk in with my left foot first. And the reason why I would do that is because Muhammad is reputed to have done that whenever he went to do wudu. And as Muslims, devout Muslims anyway, we're supposed to try to follow Muhammad to the greatest degree possible, even in such a small detail as walking into the bathroom, how to do it. So we would remember Muhammad constantly in little steps of life. Well, then after washing up, I would go downstairs to the prayer rugs and I would pray the Fajr prayer, the first of the 5 daily prayers. And then after the Fajr prayer, I'd go to the breakfast table and my mom would give me food, but before eating, she would always say, Nabeel, what do we say before we eat? And I would say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. We would pray that small prayer before we did anything. And then we would eat the food, and after eating, my mom would say, what do we pray now? And I would pray a prayer thanking Allah for the sustenance and for making me a Muslim. And then she would send me out the front door. She'd remind me to recite a section of the Quran, a long section of Surah Al-Baqarah called Ayat Al-Kursi. And then she would also say, recite that one section of the Quran, which is a prayer that Moses recited to Allah when he was supposed to speak before the Pharaoh. In the Quran, there are stories of biblical prophets. And in this case, the Quran says that Moses stuttered and he would ask Allah for wisdom and for the ability to speak. So my mom would remind me every single day to pray that prayer as I would go to school. Now, this all would happen before 7 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that's just how much we remembered Allah constantly as devout Muslims. And then as you grow up in life, I was, of course, in middle school, but then as I got older, you start to embrace more and more of an Islamic identity. You start using your Islamic lifestyle as a marker of who you are. You see yourself as a Muslim because when you go out into the public, my mom would point this out to me. She'd say, Nabeel, your face gives you away as a Muslim. It doesn't matter how good a student you are. It doesn't matter how great a person you are. Even if you were president of the United States, people would look at your face and say, he's a Muslim. Before anything else, you represent Islam, so see yourself as an ambassador of Islam. And so Islam was my identity. I would see myself in public as a Muslim. And adult Muslims, of course, they have their own lifestyles and customs. For example, a devout Muslim will not pay interest. It's illegal according to Sharia to pay interest. A devout Muslim will not eat pork, of course, or drink alcohol. These kinds of little lifestyle markers. But also then things that are more important to a man's heart, such as meeting at the mosque for prayers and then building community that way, spending time together during the month of Ramadan, fasting together. So Islam is more than just a set of beliefs, especially for people from the East. You don't separate yourself from your beliefs like that. Islam is who you are. It's your very life, your identity. And that's how we need to understand Muslims that we interact with. Unless they were born and raised in the West, more than likely they see Islam as a part of who they are, not just what they believe. So Muslims see their faith as their identity, but there are, of course, impacts of the Islamic faith on the way Muslims see the world. So the Islamic worldview is important to understand. And basically, the way Muslims see the world, devout Muslims, is Allah has created this world to worship Him, to serve Him. And this is why, by the way, a common Muslim name is Abdullah. Abdullah means the slave or servant of Allah. So Allah has then sent messengers to every single people throughout history in order for people to know who Allah is. According to Muslims, 124,000 such messengers called prophets have come to this world to lead every people group to Allah, to point to Allah. And so Allah has sent prophets such as Adam, Noah, Moses, Abraham, Lot, Jacob. All of these names show up in the Quran as messengers that Allah has sent to guide people. Now, according to the average Muslim, the full message was never given. It was only partial messages given to each people as it was required for their time. So for example, Muslims will often say that Moses received part of the message that he shared with his people, what they needed to hear, which was be willing to fight against the Pharaoh and the Egyptians in order to liberate yourselves. Whereas another part of the message was given to another prophet who is Jesus. Muslims believe that Jesus is a prophet and a Messiah, but not God himself. Jesus was given a part of the message, which was do not resist, show grace. And they believe that had Jesus been given the message to fight, then the early Christians would have been slaughtered. So Muslims say that Moses got part of the message, Jesus got part of the message, all these different people got parts of the message as their people needed to hear it. It wasn't until the final prophet, Muhammad, when one man was receiving the entire revelation and he was able to pass that on to the Muslims, to his followers. And that is the final revelation. No law would come after Muhammad. And so that's the way Muslims see the progression from the beginning of the world until the advent of Islam. Now, you may have noticed that I said Muslims believe Jesus is the Messiah, and that's true, they do. But they don't use the word Messiah the same way Christians do. And in fact, Jews don't use the word Messiah the same way Christians do. Everyone interprets that word slightly differently. The way Muslims see the Messiah is someone chosen by God to offer the reformed revelation of Judaism, try to bring people back to what Moses had taught. But unfortunately, Muslims believe that after Jesus was raised to heaven, and they do believe that, the followers of Jesus slowly began to abandon his message, that they turned him into a god, and by doing so committed blasphemy. So the concept of the Messiah is that Jesus was a reformer, but that ultimately Christians started their own religion. Muslims believe that all these former prophets who came were themselves Muslims. The word Muslim means one who submits. It's a form of the word Islam. Islam means submission. Muslim is one who submits. And so all the prophets, including Jesus, Moses, Abraham, etc., Muslims believe that they were all Muslims and their followers were Muslims because they submitted to Allah. It wasn't until later, when their messages slowly became corrupted, that people left their Islamic faith. And that's the important point here. Muslims believe that Judaism slowly became corrupted, that Christianity slowly became corrupted, and that Islam is the only incorruptible faith. Allah has miraculously guarded Islam. So Muhammad is the final messenger, the Quran is the final text. Those messages and the Quran will be guarded till the end of times, according to Muslims. Now, the essential message of Islam then is that we ought to submit to Allah. We ought to follow Him. So whereas in Christianity you may have come to realize that the essential message, the critical problem of mankind is that we have sinned and rebelled against God. That's not the case in Islam. In Islam, the essential message is we are all ignorant and we have all gone our own ways. And if we are just guided, if we're just told how to follow God, then we will and we can. And so we need to have rules to follow. And that's what Sharia is. Sharia is Islamic law. It's how you should live in order to submit to Allah. It doesn't come in the form of a book. If you want to read the 613 laws that the Jews had to follow, the mitzvot, you just read the Torah. They're found there. That's not how Sharia works. It's much more complicated than that. You have the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, the Holy Scripture. And then you have the traditions of Islam. You have the Hadith and the Sunnah. These are the things that Muhammad said and did. Muslims use those to interpret the Quran and to expand upon things not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. Those two are the main components of Sharia. There are two additional components of Sharia. There's the consensus of the Muslim scholars in analogical reasoning called qiyas, but that's less important. Really what we ought to understand is Islamic law is not just derived from the Quran. It's derived from a composite of the understandings of the Quran and the Hadith. So when we understand what Sharia is, we have to then follow it. Well, how do we understand it? As Muslims, how ought we follow Sharia? Well, we don't have the training to understand it ourselves. We have to hear it from the scholars. We have to listen to our imams. We have to hear it, the precedents as they have been given from centuries past. And so Muslims generally do not themselves engage in interpreting the Hadith and the Quran. They usually receive that from their imams. This is why, by the way, there are so many different views of Islam, because people are receiving the interpretation from a wide body of Hadith literature and the Quran. And many of these Hadith, certain Muslims say, well, these are not trustworthy. Other Hadith are trustworthy. And different Muslims will disagree with them. They'll say, no, those are trustworthy and these are not. And so disagreeing on the body of canonical literature is what causes Muslims to have so many different varieties of Islam. Peaceful Islam, as we see in the West, many Muslims say Islam is a religion of peace. Well, part of the reason why they say that is because of the way they interpret the Hadith and the Quran, which Hadith they use and which verses of the Quran they interpret through those Hadith. Other Muslims, such as terrorists in the Middle East, they will interpret the violent Hadith as the ones that take precedent, and they will interpret the violent sections of the Quran as the one they ought to follow. So it's because of the way Sharia is interpreted that we have such a wide expression of Islam in the Islamic world. But at the end of the day, the basic worldview is the same. Allah wants us to submit to Him and to follow the law that He's given, Sharia. Now that we understand what Muslims believe and how they see the world, it's important to get a little bit more of an idea of how many there are and where we can find them. A Pew Forum survey indicated that in 2011, there were 2.6 million Muslims in the United States. Now that's 0.8% of the US population, just under 1%, but the percentage is projected to grow. By the year 2030, approximately 1.7% of the US population will be Muslim. That's 1 out of every 50 people. But when you put this number in global perspective, there are 1.61 billion Muslims around the world. That's a quarter of the world's population. Let's compare that now to the Christian demographic so we can get some perspective. The following year, a Pew Forum survey showed that there are 243 million Christians in the United States. That's 78%, over 3/4. And globally, there are 2.2 billion Christians in the world. That's 32% of the world's population. Now you might say, Nabeel, I don't think all those people are actually Christian. They probably don't follow Jesus or really understand the beliefs. And I would actually agree with you. These are people who self-identify as Christians. And the fact of the matter is, the same is the case for Islam. Not all the people who self-identify as Muslims are actually living an Islamic lifestyle. Many of them might be nominal Muslims. But when we take a look at the figures, 1/4 of the world does self-identify as Muslim. So it is important to understand how to interact with them and who they are. Around the world, there are various kinds of Muslims. Not all Muslims believe the same thing. There are two major branches of Islam. Sunni Islam, which makes up 80 to 85% of the Muslims in the world, and Shia Islam, which makes up about 10 to 13% of the Muslims. So if you run across a Muslim, chances are they are Sunni Muslim. And when you hear people talk about Islam, they're probably talking about Sunni Islam. The other 2 to 5% of Muslims around the world are various other sects of Islam that don't quite fit in easily into Sunni or Shia Islam. Now, around the world, Muslims often tend to point the finger at one another and say, you are not Muslim or you are not Muslim. For example, throughout most of the Middle East, less than 40% of Sunni Muslims see Shia as Muslim. But in certain places where Sunni and Shia live close to one another, like Iraq and Lebanon, they understand that they are Muslim. So we have to understand that there's a lot of division within Islam. And how ought we approach these Muslims? How ought we understand whether someone is a Muslim or not? My suggestion to you is if someone follows Muhammad and declares the Shahada, this is the Islamic proclamation, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. If someone exclusively follows Muhammad and Allah, then they are a Muslim. That's my best indicator of how to determine whether someone is a Muslim or not without getting embroiled in their own polemics. Now, I just mentioned Iraq and Lebanon. Most people do associate Muslims with the Middle East, but it's interesting to note that the nation with the most Muslims in the world is Indonesia. And the second nation with the most Muslims in the world is Pakistan, number 3 is India, and number 4 is Bangladesh. None of these are Middle Eastern countries. And so we ought not think that Muslims just come from the Middle East. They come from all over the world. And with these different national backgrounds come lots of different cultures. Indonesian culture is different from Pakistani culture. Pakistani culture is different from Moroccan culture. So let's keep in mind that the culture for Muslims can vary tremendously. Only about 20% of Muslims come from the Middle East and North Africa, and their lifestyle, their language is quite different from, say, a Bosnian Muslim or a Turkish Muslim. So the point of all this is that there are different denominations and branches of Islam, that there are different cultures and national backgrounds for Muslims, and even considering that, there are different levels of devotion for Muslims. Some of them are very, very devout and some are completely nominal. The upshot of all this is that Muslims are individuals. When you run into a Muslim, when you meet a Muslim neighbor or friend, you have to get to know them for who they are. There's simply no way to paint everyone with the same broad brush strokes. Get to know your friends, get to know who they are and what they see about Islam, how they understand it, how they live it in their lives, so that you can interact and love them personally. A relatively new phenomenon is Muslims who are being born and raised in the West. Now, that's me myself. I was born in the United States, raised in the West, and so I see the world differently from those who are raised in the East. Now, of course, we might have the same religion. We might even be in the same family. For example, my parents were born and raised in the East. But we see the world differently because the West's culture has an impact on the way we understand things. The most prominent way in which there's a difference between East and West is what I would call, and others call as well, the honor-shame paradigm. In the East, people tend to make decisions based on honor and shame, whereas in the West, we tend to make decisions based on innocence and guilt. What do I mean by that? Well, in the West, people tend to think, is this thing right or wrong? I'm going to do what I think is right. So even if someone does something that is wrong, we tend to exculpate them if they thought it was the right thing to do. Whereas in the East, that's not the case at all. It doesn't really matter what you think is right or wrong. You should do what is socially the right thing to do, what everyone tells you is the right thing to do, what the authority tells you is the right thing to do. So for example, we see that very commonly in marriages. In the East, arranged marriages are a common phenomenon because parents, friends, aunts and uncles, grandparents, everyone thinks that you should marry a certain person, therefore you should marry them. It doesn't matter if you think you should marry them or not. You should marry them because everyone else thinks so. And so that's one way this is often displayed in the East. Another way is in terms of how we react to things that we think we needed to do, we felt compelled to do, but others shouldn't know about, because if they did find out, we would lose honor. It would bring shame upon our family. And so in the East, there is a great tendency to hide things. People will try to just brush things under the rug. And we've seen that a lot in the past, but also in the present with, for example, family members that have certain incapacitations, be it physical or mental. They'll often be hidden from view. When people are victims of crimes, for example, rape or sexual abuse of some kind, often that will be hidden, and you won't go to therapy. Therapy would be shameful. And so those are the kinds of phenomenons that happen because of the honor-shame paradigm. People are coming from that cultural background to the United States. And so we need to understand that they often see the world differently from those raised in the West. Now, people like me, my parents were from that paradigm, so I have some of that in me, but I was raised in the West, so I have a lot of the innocent and guilt perspective driving me as well. So it helps to understand that not everyone in the world sees things the same way we do. People may actually think and process differently. It's very fascinating to get to know other people's cultures. And in fact, we shouldn't see our culture as necessarily better than theirs. If you read the Old Testament, you will find that in many cases, it was an honor-shame paradigm that was present amongst the Jews in the Old Testament. So it's not about better or worse. We ought not see ourselves as superior. Just understand that others may see the world and process matters differently, and we might have to spend some time and some effort getting to know them and understanding them before we can click the way we want to. One last thing to notice about people from the Middle East, they are often a very passionate people. And so they love hospitality, they love putting people in their homes and taking care of them and just giving them more food than they could ever hope to eat. But another thing that they're passionate about are the very things that we tend to be reserved about in the West. I remember when I was in second grade, I was asking a teacher what party she was going to vote for here in the US, and she looked at me and she said, "Nabeel, we do not talk about politics and religion." And I just remember thinking, really? That's all we talk about at home is politics and religion. And that's how Muslims generally are, from the Middle East anyway, and from various other Islamic cultures. People talk about what they're passionate about. And so they're expecting you to talk about what you're passionate about. And this is why I suggest to Christians that they feel free to talk about their faith, because Muslims are expecting it. And feel free to talk about politics too. Just don't be upset if other people get passionate and respond passionately. That's actually a sign of them being engaged in what you're saying. So don't be afraid. Engage in these matters. Talk about these things. But specifically, I would suggest you not be afraid to discuss apologetics with Muslims. Because Muslims, usually speaking, if they're devout and they've come from the mosque and they've heard their imams preach, they've usually heard arguments as to why Islam is true and Christianity is false. And these aren't peripheral matters to them. They are a part of their worldview. This is why they can have confidence in Islam. They are confident Muslims often because they see Christianity as blasphemous. They see the Trinity as polytheism. So I could never become a Christian. That would be polytheism. That would be blasphemy. So that's a part of the way that they respond to other religions. That's partially why they are really passionate about the Quran, because they believe the Quran is the inspired word of God. It has science in it. It has miraculous mathematical patterns. It has prophecies that came true. So these apologetic arguments form the basis of their confidence. In the West, a lot of Christians are Christian because they enjoy their relationship with Christ, and that's fine. A lot of other Christians are Christians because they were raised in a Christian home, not necessarily because of the apologetics. And so the apologetic issues often don't come up. But for Muslims, they want to discuss reasons to believe. They want to have the arguments. They want to talk about truth. And so be willing to engage in that. And that's part of the reason why in the next few sessions, we're going to cover a lot of the evidence, because we need to be able to share it with Muslims. As part of my ministry here in the US and around Asia and other parts of the world, what I do often when I encounter Muslims is I share the gospel with them, and then almost always they respond with questions about Jesus, about the Trinity, about the Bible. And I'm telling you this to help encourage you. Many Muslims that I have encountered, in fact, 2 just last week, after hearing the answers to some of these questions, were willing to accept the gospel. And so it does happen. It happened for me. After 3.5 years of investigating Christianity and Islam, it was then that I turned to God and asked Him to reveal Himself to me. And it was dreams and visions combined with an encounter with the God of the New Testament. It was when I opened up the Bible after all of that I finally gave my life to Christ. But in order to get to that point, I needed my friend to share answers with me, for him to be able to help me through this minefield of evidence and information. Because there is a lot of misinformation out there about the Bible. Muslims believe, for example, that the Bible's been corrupted. Muslims believe that the Trinity is 3 gods, not 1 God. And so my friend David had to walk with me through these questions over the course of many, many years. Now, he wasn't an expert, by the way. It wasn't that he knew all the answers. It was that he was willing to look up the answers when the questions came around. And that's all I'm suggesting you do. Be willing to look up answers to questions as you converse with Muslims, and that will go a long, long way. There are barriers that people have erected between them and hearing the gospel. People will say to me, Nabeel, we can't argue others into the faith. We can't argue people into the kingdom. And I would tend to agree with that. We can't. But there are barriers between them and hearing the gospel for what it is. Apologetics destroys those barriers so people can hear the gospel clearly. And at that point, it's between them and God, whether or not they will receive the gospel. But it's our task to witness. And for those of us witnessing to Muslims, it means oftentimes discussing these passionate issues of religion and apologetics. So, in sum, Muslims come from a variety of places around the world. They have a variety of beliefs, but there is a basic worldview that we can engage with. And thankfully, there's a lot in common in that worldview and ours. They believe in a God. They believe in truth. They believe in morality. They believe in heaven and hell. All we have to do is begin to show them the reliability of the gospel message, of the Bible, of the Trinity, of Jesus' death and resurrection. And we need to be conversant with them about Muhammad and the Quran. And this can happen over time. And when we do, we can level the path such that we can reach them with the truth of the gospel.